I guess the big shots are in Singapore, so I'll introduce myself. I'm John Marston. I'm a professor at El Colegio de Mexico and at the Center for Asian and African Studies at El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. I've been doing work on Cambodia for quite a few years. My doctoral work was in anthropology. And over the years, I've done research on a number of things, but what I'm most associated with is working on Cambodian religion, and that's what I'll be talking about tonight. And so the talk tonight is based on my research about Cambodian. As you can see from the title, it's about Cambodians monks studying in Sri Lanka and India, but the related phenomenon of pilgrimages and temples. There's this phenomenon of the building of Cambodian-style temples in these two countries, which I see as a related phenomenon. And I'll be giving a paper on this at another conference in August. So in a way, I wanted to give this talk as sort of a dry run for that talk. So I don't have a written paper. What I was able to get done was to prepare this PowerPoint. And so I'll be talking a little bit informally. And so I hope that will work. I feel like my ideas are beginning to come together, but this is not polished work. This is not a final product, but it's something that is beginning to coalesce, I think. I just came back from field research in Sri Lanka and India, and so some of this is based on very recent research. Although I've been working on this in one way or another for 2 or 3 years, I believe. And so let's just start with an image. This is the Sri Lankan temple, Khmer temple. You can see the monks. This is, I think, is purports to be almost all the monks in Sri Lanka. They're smiling, they're happy. Notice that they're all a certain age group as you expect of monks, except that a few are very young. You see the new temple. I mean, it's not exactly a temple. It's really a dormitory, a new wall, a temple gate. It's making progress, and so this is part of what I'm looking at. And then I start showing this video. This is a video from India, and it just gives you another sense of this little taste for things. And one of the I guess the sound isn't coming out, but anyway, get your feeling for it. Actually, when I went to India, I went to several of these sites, but I don't actually recognize this site. And I think the important thing about this video is that these pilgrimage groups are being documented. They are making their own videos, and they're very professional quality too. Yeah. And see, the man there actually has a connection to, well, you could say this connected to CKS because, do any of you know who he is? His name is Kelly Mut. He's a lay preacher. He preaches on the radio, and he actually is based at Wat Nak. So if any of you are at Wat Nak and you want to ask about him, that's actually where he's based. And he also often goes with these tour groups to India, perhaps to Sri Lanka as well. Okay, anyway, that's let's start with the general context. And I'm not an expert on Sri Lanka or India, although I've learned a lot in a short time. Just remember that the two contexts are very different. Sri Lanka is a quite small country. I can't remember, it's a little bigger than Cambodia, a little smaller than Cambodia, but it's comparable in size to Cambodia. It's considered a Theravada Buddhist country. At least Theravada is a dominant religion, although it has other competing religions, we could say, that Hinduism, Islam is also important, and so there's a certain militancy about Theravada Buddhism that you don't find so much in Cambodia so far. It's been a country that has been involved in Buddhist missionary activities. That is to say, Buddhist missionaries both within Sri Lanka and sending consciously developing Buddhist missionaries who would go to countries outside of Sri Lanka. In the case of Sri Lanka, the roots of the Cambodian connection are Sri Lankans who lived and worked in Cambodia, some of the monks who spent time in Cambodia. And when we're looking at the history of Cambodian monks, Cambodian involvement in Sri Lanka, we find the presence of very powerful Sri Lankan figures or other figures there. As opposed to India, there were, I believe, some of my notes are back in Mexico. I haven't been able to recheck everything that I have, but I believe there were at least a couple of Cambodian monks who studied in Sri Lanka before the war, but this doesn't seem to be a significant factor in the pattern of what's happening now. What happening now started in the 1990s. The monks, the Sri Lankans who were sponsoring Cambodians, some of them had older, longer relation to Cambodia, but there's no continuity with monks from Cambodia having gone earlier who are going now. In contrast, India, as you all know, is a huge country, an incredibly large, complex country. Most people think of Buddhism as having died out in India. It's a more complex thing than that. But Buddhism exists, but it's a fairly peripheral religion in India at the present time. But it's undergoing a revival. I don't know how much this means in numbers of population in a country as big, but it's since the 1950s, for very complex reasons, there has been a revival of interest in Buddhism, especially in a certain caste group, the elite. And this is a complex phenomenon, and with that, we find a growth of university courses in Buddhism and a lot of social institutions. India is a country that receives Buddhist missionaries. It received Buddhist missionaries from Sri Lanka, as well as from Japan, an important Buddhist movement is actually a British whose guru was actually British, who's now working with the Buddhist in India. So India is sort of the object of Buddhist interest. As we all know, of course, but India is the place where the Buddha lived. And so India is sort of the homeland for Buddhism. It's the place of sacred sites which people who go to make Buddhist pilgrimage would be going to India. And this itself has its own history. It's something that's developed in the 20th century. Again, there's a Sri Lankan role in the construction, the monumentalization of Buddhist sites in India. The other thing, as opposed to Sri Lanka, that, as I said, there was no continuity there didn't seem to be continuity between the monks, the Cambodian monks who studied in Sri Lanka prior to the war, and the ones who were coming there now. But in the case of India, there is a significant link between the pre-Pol Pot period Cambodian studies in India and what has developed now. So what I'm going to talk about now is sort of a narrative. First I'll talk about Sri Lanka, then I'll talk about India. It's always a little dangerous to talk about Buddhist monks in anything but a very positive way. I didn't invite Buddhist monks to come tonight, although if they'd come I would have been happy. There is a place in Buddhist hell for people who foment disputes among monks, and so I want to be very careful about what I do. So I want to preface all my remarks by saying I'm going to, in English we have the expression warts and all. I'm going to show things warts and all. To me, history or anthropology is showing sort of conflicts, tensions, as well as the good things. And so what I want to emphasize is that even though I'm going to describe some negative things, that ultimately I think the things I'm describing are positive. There was conflict, there's tension, there's warts, but at the same time I think my vision of what's going on is something positive. Well, this is what we're talking about is just a fairly complex phenomenon, and we can talk about that. So, in Sri Lanka, as I said, there were some important sponsors of Cambodian monks. You have some pictures here that usually when we start learning about this, we think of this woman, Hema Gunatilake. I don't know if anyone here was in Cambodia. Did you ever know her? Karen? Yeah. So when I first started coming to Cambodia, she was very much on the scene here in Cambodia. She's a very powerful Sri Lankan woman. And she was here in Cambodia. She first came at the UNTAC period. She first was here in connection with the UN. Later on, she worked for quite a few years with the Heinrich Bull Foundation. She was actually played a very important role in the reconstruction of the Buddhist Institute. She was also very active in promoting the Cambodian Nuns and Lay Women's Association. She was very interested in these issues. So she's many of her things she's doing are very positive. Now she's returned to Sri Lanka. She's also very Buddhist nationalist in some ways that not all her scholars are comfortable with. But for our purposes, that she played this key role in bringing Sri Lankan monks Cambodian monks to Sri Lanka. Often when I first started looking at this, people would say she was the first. Actually, there was another man who was here in Cambodia about the same time. He worked for Asian Development Bank as a statistician. He's the man here in the corner, Raja Korle. Actually, he was also about the same time. He had friendships with monks. He began to cultivate connections. He actually brought Cambodian monks before Hema did. Hema she brought at least 2 different groups of Cambodian monks to Sri Lanka. In some way they were her groups, but in some way they were monks they were sponsored by Sri Lankan monks. The first one there was a monk named Venerable Mapalagama Wipulsa. He had been to Cambodia in the 60s. He had an interesting connection to Cambodia through what was called the Asian Buddhist Conference for Peace. This was a sort of an international Buddhist society that was more socialist in orientation. It was the socialist countries that had Buddhism tended to send their representatives to the conferences, to the congresses of this organization, and Cambodia this was an important organization in the reestablishment of Cambodian Buddhism after the Pol Pot period, during the PRK period. And so he was involved in this, and so he had an interest in Cambodia. The first 10 monks sponsored by Hema went to his temple in the outskirts of Colombo. And then the last one in the corner, I mean, there were some monks that were not affiliated with any of these monks, but the other person I'll mention is the Mo'omalabi Somitatero. He also was in Cambodia with the UN, working in the Ministry of Environment. It's a long story too. He also had this special interest in Cambodian monks, and probably through Hema he also began at a certain point to sponsor Cambodian monks to go to Sri Lanka. He's a very political monk. Those of you who have anthropological training may know the name Stanley Tambaya. On this recent trip to Sri Lanka, Stanley Tambaya has a book called Buddhism Betrayed, and in the original Buddhist version of this book it had a picture of two monks arguing on the cover, and this was very controversial. It was partly because of this picture that the book was banned in Sri Lanka, and I just learned that he was one of the monks whose picture was on the cover of that book. But these early monks went with scholarships from Sri Lanka. So their expenses were paid from Sri Lanka. It was very much a Sri Lankan thing. And but they were also sort of under the control of powerful monks once they got to Sri Lanka. The different places they went, the different settings, each had a different profile. It was different from one place to another, but I think they were all placed in temples that had a strong missionary tradition. So in a way, the monks who were interested in Cambodia were monks who were interested in Buddhist missionization. So there's something good and something bad. It has a complex implication. What I want to say is that, and we don't have the time to go into this in detail, it was not smooth sailing. That these early monks, in fact, some of them work back on this period as it was not successful at all in their words. Although my own argument is that if you look at the total trajectory, if you look at the success stories and not the failures, that overall I think it resulted in several of the monks did not finish degrees. They came back here, left the monkhood. What I'm told is some of them had less to do with Buddhism than they had if they'd ever gone to Sri Lanka. But the success stories are real success stories. So you have monks, I think at least 5 monks. Some of them are no longer monks, but they're professors in the Buddhist university now. And so it's, when you consider the limited number of monks who are going, or some others are, at least one is high-ranking person in the Ministry of Religion. And so there are monks who have come back and had a place in the Cambodian Buddhist educational system, which I think is, you have to recognize as something positive. Some of them had problems with food. Actually, the stories I was getting, when I first heard about why the Cambodian monks were not happy in Sri Lanka, I was told stories they couldn't take the food, that the food was very hot, and I always didn't take this that serious. I always thought must be other things going on, and then I finally interpreted in this project a monk, an ex-monk who was, he really told the story about how difficult it was with food and how he developed stomach problems and had to come back. And so food was a real issue, especially with these first groups who were later on the monks who had found ways of having a bit more autonomy. They could control a bit more what they ate. Another issue, though, was authoritarianism of the temples, or what the monks perceived as authoritarianism. It was a different style of being in the temple than within in Cambodia. They felt like they could not escape the sort of the surveillance of the abbots. This was something difficult for them, and over time, part of it you see is monks trying to find ways of going to Sri Lanka, accomplishing their goals, but avoiding these negative things that they had problems with. Another source of tension, which sort of relates to the other, is that they were, especially at the beginning, at this time, they were put in classes with children, basically, with young novices. These were full-grown men, but they were put in classes with Sri Lankan monks who were still children, and so this had to do with their level of education, but it led to dissatisfaction. As I said, some monks simply just came back. It didn't work out for them. Hema had more than one wave of more than one group of students. In her second group, although I just interviewed her again, and she said, oh, no, there's no difference in the first group and the second group. But clearly the monks who came, the second group, they began to choose younger monks. And they also made a point of putting them in temples further away from Colombo. And this sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. In the worst cases, it meant that these young, very young monks just ran away from their temples and came to Colombo. But in the best of the cases, because they were young, they were able to learn similes, they were able to enter into the system more than older monks could. And they're also, among these younger monks are some of the success stories. I'm not going very fast. I don't know how much I'm going to cover before my time is up. At a certain point, I'm just going to stop and let you ask questions. The Cambodian monks were very motivated to study university level. They wanted to get university degrees, and they felt like the system was not allowing them to do what they came to do. And so there was formation of the Cambodian Monks Student Association. This was significant. There was an interesting point when some monks decided to withdraw from their sponsors, withdraw from the temples where they'd been, and actually came back to Cambodia and then went back on their own. And this is not always recognized by the Sri Lankans involved in this, but they point to these are the monks who were successful. At least in two cases, these are quite high-ranking monks. But they made a who were still monks, they made a deliberate decision to withdraw themselves from the authority of the abbots where they were in Sri Lanka. And they went back to Cambodia, came back to Cambodia, and they went on their own so that they could pursue their studies without the supervision of the. So after this, there began to be a different kind of pattern of monks going. There was monks who went on their own. As I said, what does it mean to go on their own? When I interview people, they used to use this phrase. But the point is that they were no longer under the sponsorship of Sri Lankans. And sometimes they went with family support, or they raised enough donations to go. Sometimes they had a sponsor from Cambodia or overseas communities who would help pay the way, cover their expenses in Sri Lanka. And more monks came on their own in this way. And they were able to study in universities. They were able to they were to succeed. This seemed to work in a way that the first wave of things didn't. This also worked because more and more monks had a higher level of education in Cambodia. They had higher levels of English, so things were beginning to work more in this way. There were also child monks still kept coming. To me, this is an interesting phenomenon which I haven't been able to document as much as I'd like, that I personally am a bit uncomfortable with these sending your children to a foreign country as a monk. But they were, many times it was relatives of monks who were coming as child monks. The monk I talked about this, who had finally came out, yes, these were his relatives. He said, be very careful in choosing the setting where the child monks will be. And again, it's like sending your child to military school. So under the right circumstances, it could be a good thing. Although it's also a shock to the system. Anyway, I don't want to rush through this because I have other things to cover. I would like to mention that a new scholarship program, in some ways, there are monks who are no longer going on their own, they're going with scholarships. There's an organization called Khmer Buddhist Educational Assistance Program. Some of you who have been around for a while might know someone named Peter Galipop. He was also someone who dates to the refugee camp period and Woodpack period. Still comes to Cambodia as a consultant now and then. And he has his own organization called Keep, and this money gives support to monks who are studying at the Buddhist University here now, but it also, they have an agreement with the Khyentse Foundation. The Khyentse Foundation is a Tibetan Buddhist organization, and through the Khyentse Foundation they have money to send monks who are studying at the master doctoral level to Sri Lanka, and this has been very successful. I think they're very careful at selecting the monks. The monks are committed to coming back and teaching at the Buddhist University when they come back. So anyway, all this, I still haven't talked about pilgrimage groups or temples, but I'm going to talk about India first, because the pilgrimage groups and the temple building occurred in Sri Lanka later, whereas more important in India from the beginning. So now we move to India, and what I'd like to emphasize is the roots in what's going on in India with what was taking place prior to the Pol Pot period. There were monks going from Cambodia to India in the 60s and early 70s, maybe beginning in the late 50s. The most famous of these is Mahagosananda. And when I went to India, I was especially fascinated to meet two of the former monks, the Dr. Sambe and Kyo Kama, who were they'd been monks at this time. And it's a sort of fascinating story, which I guess I won't have time to go into, but this relates to the revival of Buddhism in India and the creation of centers for Buddhist study. And so these monks were studying at Nalanda University, I think all of them, which is at the site of an ancient Buddhist university. And some of these were sort of caught in limbo when Cambodia fell to Pol Pot. As you know, Mahagosananda, I'd have to check on the trajectory of his career, but he ended up going to Japan and the United States. He had his own trajectory as a monk. Other monks end up sort of in limbo. They end up leaving the monkhood. There wasn't that much place yet for Buddhist monks in India. They lived on the money they got from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and they were in this strange limbo, but they continued to have connections to Buddhist another. Some of these monks became announcers for Voice of America, which is, to me, is something I want to follow. Some of these had ambiguous citizenship. The abbot, for many years, of the Cambodian temple in New Delhi, and I need to clarify exactly when this happened, but because he couldn't go back to Cambodia, he went to Thailand, he became a Thai citizen. Then he went back to India, and he began to create temples that were Thai temples, or a Thai temple. And at a Buddhist sacred site, later on, he created a Cambodian temple in New Delhi. And these temples are, at least the one at Savatthi, is ambiguous. It's a Thai temple or Khmer temple. Sometimes they claim one, sometimes they claim another. Another one of these figures who turned out to be important when Cambodian monks began to go to study, when the pilgrimage groups began to go, was a Khmer crown monk. So again, there was a certain ambiguity. In some ways he was Khmer, in some ways he Vietnamese. He spent time, but he also left the monkhood. But again, he had this connection with Buddhist institutions in different ways. He lived in these temples. He lived eventually when they began creating Cambodian temples, he lived in Cambodian temples until his death. And with time, and he also became a monk again. So student monks began going in the 1990s. Some of them went, there was all, by this time, there was the temple in the New Delhi that was created. It was already being frequented by Cambodians from the United States or from Europe. Then Cambodians from Cambodia began to go there. One of the first monks went there to be at that monk. Another monk, Sampit, went with the idea of staying at the New Delhi temple, but was told a better place to study was Nalanda. Other monks went to study Goenka-style meditation. They ended up there studying in Nalanda as well. And these became the foundation for groups of monks studying in India, which began to increase and increase more and more after that. In the case of India, most all the monks go on their own. The Indian government does have a few scholarships for monks. Maybe there might be a handful of Cambodian monks studying with scholarships from the Indian government. These are not scholarships specifically for monks. They're scholarships for any Cambodian students, but some of them are used by monks. Anyway, now there are perhaps about 120 Cambodian monks studying in India. So the point I would make, especially when we began talking about India, we began talking about the fact that monks and the pilgrimage groups and building of Cambodian temples these are separate phenomena. You can't say that where you have one, you have the others, and yet they tend to overlap. They tend to, in some ways, be related phenomenon. So you have pilgrimage groups. They will meet with the Cambodian monks when they go to the area. Sometimes they will make donations to the monks. They'll often make donations to the monks, and sometimes specific monks will guide pilgrimage groups, and individuals will establish connections with those monks, which will result in their continuing financial support by these persons. There began to be the building of Cambodian-style temples, perhaps partly with the idea of providing a place for the monks to live, but also because this served the needs of these pilgrimage groups, which needed a comfortable place. I mean, a comfortable place, not in the sense of physical comfort, but a place which they felt was their own culture and language where they could easily stay when there were going to be sites. And for various reasons, the pilgrims who went to India felt motivated to donate to the building of temples in India, especially in India, to build temples at these sacred sites. And they built them there because there was already, since the 50s, this movement to build temples connected with different Buddhist traditions of different nationalities. And they felt motivated to see a Cambodian presence there, along with the Japanese and Thai and Tibetan presence, as a way of, so pilgrims were motivated to have a place they could stay when they went there, but also to see Cambodian Buddhism recognized and present at these sacred sites in India. So there had been, since the 80s, at least, there were Cambodian from overseas countries going on pilgrimages to the sacred sites. There's one of the older men we talked about, Dr. Sambay. He was involved in this since the 80s. Then in the 90s, these became more consistent, more formalized. In addition to Cambodians from overseas countries, there began to be groups coming from Cambodia itself. This by the late 90s, I believe. One of these monks, as I said, one of the first monks to come to India in the 90s was named Prof. And Prof. played a major role in building, he continues to play a major role in building temples and organizing pilgrimage groups to India. There's Dr. Now I'm thinking the older man who I talked about. He's a very witty man, and the word metta means, as many of you know, means sometimes translated in English as loving kindness. And he said, you know, there are divisions. Some people are pro-metta, some people are anti-metta. He said, well, there's the metta groups and the non-metta groups. And so there's a certain dynamic to this, which becomes complicated. I think I'm going to rush through this and just say there's a certain style to the metta temples. There's a certain style to the temples that are non-metta temples. And here's some, on the left we have these metta temples, which are much more ambitious. They're oriented toward pilgrims. The one on the top is the one at Bodh Gaya. It's the most fully developed, especially in this picture. It looks very completed, although all of them are sort of not quite completed. It can house a lot of people. And then he has like 7 different sites, one of them in Nepal, all in different stages of completion. And he's been very successful at fundraising. He spends 4 years in the United States every year. And a lot of that time is spent fundraising. And so he has sort of it's a very ambitious project, but maybe a little bit too ambitious. If I may insert a note of criticism there. Although then you have these other tools, which are smaller in scale, and yet they're actually finished, and or some of them are finished, and so you have a certain different style, and some pilgrims are gravitating to one style or the other, and so this is part of the dynamic. So Well, I think I'm going to rush through the rest and then open it up to questions. Well, I'll just show you another video since they were so kind as to. This is Pilgrims in Sri Lanka again, and this was originally put on my computer. I was giving a talk which is more oriented to the issue of donation. So I chose these things that show jewels and gold that are being donated at the Tooth Relic in Kandy. Let's just show this quickly. And this is a group that went with Boots, who's an important Buddhist figure in Cambodia and who I've written about in the past. This is Boots anyway, these are all things that we donated to. Obviously shows that the people going on this pilgrimage were quite wealthy. They were in a position to make this donation. This is the roof of this. Well, actually, it's the roof, but it's also the bottom. The Tooth Relic is actually the chamber above that. So here you see the pilgrims. They're going to the different rooms and the Tooth Relic temple. It's not all that clear what they're doing from the video itself, except you can see them there going from one room to another. To give a sense of these, so then eventually the next pictures are at the Tooth Relic. I like the fact that there's no camera and yet they're taking a picture. That's the reliquary holding the Tooth Relic itself. Okay, then there is a temple being built in Sri Lanka. It's only recently built, and there was inauguration in November of the temple in Sri Lanka. The president of Sri Lanka was present partly because the temple has these connections to this very political monk. In February, there was a Sima ceremony for a temple, Cambodian temple in Varanasi, and then the last, some ideas here about what it all means, and this is a picture of a Cambodian monk who's lived in Canada for many years, who got his doctorate in 2004. But I think I'd like there to be some time for questions, so I think I'm just going to end it there, and I hope we can have some questions too. So I'd be very interested in your comments and questions.
I think I missed the first 5 minutes, but I was just wondering, what is the real reason that Cambodian monks started going? Is it for pilgrimage? I mean, going to Sri Lanka, going to India.
They went, I guess.
Has that been going on for hundreds of years?
No, it hasn't. Well, that would be an interesting question. I mean, there may have been, according to Hema Gunati, there may have been Sri Lankan monks who went to Cambodia over the centuries. Supposedly, I mean, there was one of Jayavarman, the Seven Sons, went to Sri Lanka. Actually, there's good archival record of that. But it's husband told me on this trip. He said, well, some of them are instrumentally motivated, which is not completely fair, but it's true as well. I mean, there are idealistic elements. There are also just the desire to see the world and to get an education. And so they, especially when they first started going, there were not that many opportunities for Buddhist education. So the level of Buddhist education you can get in Sri Lanka is still better than what you can get in Cambodia. I think that's true also in India. And so they go to have the opportunity to study, and they go because it's exciting for them to go to another country. And actually, even at the present time, I was told that, I don't know if this is true, but that if you can manage to get the airfare, once you're in Sri Lanka, it's actually cheaper as a Buddhist monk to live and study in Sri Lanka than it would be for you to live and study in Cambodia.
Is there any of the reverse happening? Is there any?
No.
In Cambodia?
Although there is a lot of, it's not just Cambodians going to study in Sri Lanka, it's a whole complex network. And what I haven't said is that I chose to focus my research on Sri Lanka and India, partly because there's this interesting phenomenon of the temple building in those two places. But there's also Cambodian monks going to study in Burma and Thailand, and also Malaysia, which is harder for me to understand. But there's some Theravada Buddhism in Malaysia, but there are also some of them go from one place to another. They start in Burma, then they go to Sri Lanka, or they start in Sri Lanka and go to Burma. And then there are monks going from one country to another. There's a Theravada Buddhist tradition in Bangladesh. The Bangladeshi monks study definitely in Sri Lanka. And so it's a whole network of young monks traveling from one country to another to study. And so ideally one would want to put this in the context, this larger context of sort of transnational movement of monks for study. Yes.
I really agree.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you so much. And I was actually going to ask a little bit more about, or I was going to ask a little more about that context, the sort of transnational context within which you were studying the India and Sri Lankan cases. I'm wondering, though, if the sort of larger sort of network of sort of transnational study that you just mentioned, is that something you also see in the pre-Pol Pot era? Or has the sort of transnational nature of Cambodian Buddhist study, pilgrimage, is that something that in a broader context you see as changing significantly sort of pre and post Pol Pot period? I mean, I don't know if that's sort of too far beyond.
Well, no, it's significant. I mean, you have to separate the connection between Cambodia and Siam and the connection with Cambodia and these other countries. So, long history of Cambodian monks traveling to Siam to study, and that was part of what the French, when the French were establishing Buddhist institutions in Cambodia in the colonial period, they were trying to avoid Cambodian monks going to Siam. And so this is part of the history of Cambodian Buddhism, is that the French encouraged Cambodian institutions in order to avoid there being Thai influence. As far as Sri Lanka and Burma goes, I believe it was more something that was occurring in the post-independence period. And both Sri Lanka and Burma were playing very conspicuous roles in world Buddhism at that time. And so there began to be, and the Indian phenomenon is that there was an attempt to revive Buddhist institutions in India. And so, as I said, there were these, this is something I don't claim to understand, but there were transnational movements at that time too. And by the way, another thing which I'm interested, which I didn't bring up in this talk because it just gets too complicated, and perhaps I can't speak authoritatively, is I've been very interested in the movement of relics and what I sometimes call trafficking in relics. And so there's also certain times when relics tend to move. And in the early 50s was a period when there was a lot of relics moving from one country to another, especially from Sri Lanka and other countries. And now you find movement of relics once again. So. Okay, so. Okay, well then.